Hey, I'm Chris, and welcome to episode 10 of the Reunion Church podcast. This is Sunday Recaps, where we discuss a couple key points from the previous service for those that missed it, discussing how it may help you live out your faith. And uh, last night was a really long message. So sorry, everybody. We kind of switched things around where I actually taught this time, and we're going to switch seats. So Andrew's going to be kind of leading this one, kind of interviewing me, which is unnormal. But yeah, I mean, Andrew, just first off, what were kind of your thoughts being the observer versus the teacher last night? And just overall, how'd you think the message went?
Yeah, I think it went really good. Definitely went long. So I probably need to have you teach more so that you feel like you get your words in sooner than later. So
Yes,
instead of feeling like you have to wait that entire time to get everything out. So, but it was good. This lesson is a little tough because it's, like you had kind of talked through like, man, this is like a tough subject to kind of go around because it talks a lot and a lot of things we didn't necessarily even kind of cover because of just the sensitivity behind some of them.
Yeah.
But it talks about, you were talking about how like we are humans, and as humans, like we are physical beings, and we need to be in tune with what that means around being physical, right? And what that actually means and how that relates to ministry and stuff. So like, I guess, Chris, like, why is that even a big deal? Like for us to think and remember, oh, hey, we are human. Like I'm a human being. I live in a physical realm. Because I don't think that's something like, especially Christians normally think about. They don't think about what that means and what that entails for certain aspects of ministry.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the first thing with this whole chapter really is showing that, at least when I was studying and preparing this message, was that the main theme and the idea of being limited. When we understand that we're physical, when we understand that we're mortal, that there's a beginning and an end to who we are, that limitation really keys us in on what to really focus on, like those big rocks priorities that we talked about last week of, okay, I have a limited amount of weeks, I have a limited amount of time, and I'm limited, like this Sunday that we talked about, to a space. I'm limited to a certain place, a physical location. And I think it really just gives us perspective when we know that we're limited to trust in someone unlimited like God himself. And one of those key passages that we talked about was Acts 17, where the Apostle Paul kind of goes into detail about the everlasting God. You have this God over here. He was talking to all these philosophers, and he kind of points out that, the one true God is different from all the others. He's not like us. He's not limited. He's great when we're not. And when it came to this subject in this chapter, From Sensing Jesus by Zach Swine, that was kind of the key theme of, to live an ordinary life is to know that we're made for a period of time in a specific place. And that was just something that I wanted to reiterate over and over again, is that, we don't need to be God, especially when it comes to physical things and being physically present where we're at.
We'd kind of covered some of the physicality stuff in one of the other chapters and one of the other lessons that we'd gone through and stuff, right? But this one was more focused around like the physical being of you. Like, and not even necessarily the physical place, which I had talked a couple of weeks ago about being rooted and like having roots in a place, roots in a city, which people really kind of struggled with. But this one, it was really around the limitation and the importance of you being physically in a place. And I'm thinking through, like, we're in a day and age where we don't really have to deal with that too much.
Yeah.
Or at least we don't feel like we do. Like, you and I are in a Zoom conference right now, and, we haven't had to go physically into an office as long as we have had COVID going on.
Yeah.
And a lot of companies aren't going to go back, and we have social media and things. And, part of that is why people think teens aren't really getting licenses anymore, because they don't see that need.
Yeah.
but why that physical presence, why actually seeing someone, and like using our senses, essentially, like that physical sense. Why is that important to the Christian?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's because God made us that way. God gave us these five senses of, sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch. He gave us all of these expressions of um, our expressions of experience to really understand where we're at and what we're doing. Um, and I think when it comes to understanding that we are a physical being in a physical place, it it's really important to know when I'm in a certain place, what am I hearing? What am I hearing? What am I listening to? What's the music? What's the media? Like, what are you taking in when you hear something? Um, Being aware of the senses of touch. Like, there's some people that we know who do not have a proper understanding of touch, and they're either too hands-on or not at all, and there's some people where that's kind of a struggle of like, well, what is the rule? I don't really understand the room. Like, you know, um, like I'm thinking of one guy specifically who was this 30-plus-year-old in the young adults group years ago. And he would always hug the 19 and 20-year-old college girls. And it was
Usually not
really
the
awkward,
guys. Yeah.
really awkward for everybody of like, I don't know, man. I think a handshake's fine, or just not at all, you know? And that was one context of where that person didn't have a proper understanding of the touch aspect of being physically present, of like, all right, depending on the social situation, the social setting, what's okay? What are the rules, the unsaid rules, because one thing we kind of talked about last night was like, you go to a sports game, there's unwritten rules of how to engage with complete strangers at the ball game, right? There's certain rituals where you may do a high five or a chest bump or whatever, and everyone does it. Everyone's like in it in that super public setting. And then there's other stuff that turns into fights in stadiums because you crossed a boundary, you crossed a line. And it's so strange how it can shift so quickly because we're not aware of the touch aspect of who we are physically.
There's examples of where it is important though, like where touch is like, hey, that's actually a gift that can actually really bless someone as well. And what are like some of those things? And I know the lesson actually had a few really, really good examples, but like where does that look like? Where does touch need to come into play? Where does it need to happen?
Yeah. Well, if we look at the ministry of Jesus, there was a passage in Mark chapter 10 where there were some Bible commentators that had a lot of odd, I think, very odd and off views of what that passage was really about because they didn't understand the culture and the context. And essentially, the passage is Jesus is doing ministry, he's sharing parables, and a bunch of children come up to hear from him and to listen and to be with him. And the disciples kind of scatter them and they start sending them away of like, hey, in this culture, in this place, in this time period that they were currently in, children don't do that. They don't go to the mentor. That's the man's job, sort of thing. It's like take your kid to work day, but you do it every day. It doesn't make any sense in the mind of the disciples. So when all those kids showed up, it was really weird. But Jesus was like, if essentially flipped that on its head of if you can't, no one can enter the kingdom of God except someone who approaches it like a child. And the passage ends in Mark chapter 10, verse 16, with he laid hands on them and blessed them. And one thing that's really difficult to grasp is some commentators will look at that passage and say, Jesus crossed a line and that he touched kids. And everyone's like, whoa, that's terrible. Like, how could you do that? Like, we start jumping to all these conclusions, but we don't actually understand the culture of laying hands on someone in first century, Palestinian Judaism is different than laying hands on somebody in 2017 with the Me Too movement. It's not the same thing, right? Completely different context, completely different culture. So, especially with that passage in particular, it would have been more so like praying for them. That'd be a more appropriate way of understanding it.
Well, I think that's where most people usually go is like, oh, touch is okay with prayer. But even then, it can be kind of weird, right? But I think there's a sensitivity almost that we need to have with touch, And what would that, like, again, where is like the line? Like, what needs to kind of happen around touch? What doesn't need to happen around touch? Like, where, you know, where do you just kind of play that safe ball, I guess, of like, do we
Yeah.
just ban it all the way across? Are there certain things? And like you said, there's certain things that we do have to be watching for, but prayer could be a very awkward one where it's like, do I put my hand on their shoulder? Do I not put their hand on their shoulder? If it's a woman asking for prayer, what do I do? If I'm a man,
Yeah.
if it's a child, what do I do? Do I put my hand on their forehead and say, bless you, child? Like, what do we like?
Well, first of all, don't do that one. That's how you get kicked out of children's ministry. But I think one thing we need to consider, and it was during our last series, was the levels of belonging and understanding, okay, when you're in a certain place, you're in a certain level of belonging, and you need to see that with the people that you're with. So at a ball game, it's a public level. You can't just hug everybody at a ball game. That's weird. But
the church, you can't go around giving everyone a brotherly hug or a brotherly and sisterly kiss.
yes,
In the Lord, don't
yeah.
do
And
that.
and whereas if you're in the intimate level of belonging, of course you can hug someone else that you have an intimate relationship with, or personal relationship, you know. And I think the problem is that most of us, through our own experience in our own lifetime, get kind of stuck in one level of belonging, and we attribute that to all levels of social interaction. So let's just take the touch example, for instance. We would apply that as a personal level to everyone we talk to anywhere. So for instance, one example that we talked about was when I was in middle school, and I went to a co-op for the first time, which, if you know what a co-op is, it's kind of hard to explain, but essentially all these homeschool families get together,
yeah,
and they kind of have school, but it's not really school. It's like one day
play school.
Yeah, it's like play school. So everybody shows up, and there's not one kid. It was actually a bunch of them that were just like very touchy, very personal. And for someone who like went to public school their whole life and then only did like 1 year of homeschool, essentially, it was really like odd. Like you're crossing a line here. This is not normal. I don't know you. I don't even know your name, and you're trying to like, buddy it up with me. And that's because the people there, they grew up raising their kids in a personal or intimate level of belonging. And then when they take them out of the home to go meet other kids, they haven't taught them that this is a different setting. This is a different place. And you need to have a different approach to touch or physically being there in the moment.
Yeah.
You can't just be a parent and pinch all the kids, cheeks, which was one thing that one of the parents did, of like, that's kind of weird, and this happens over and over in so many different examples of, there's people in relationships.
Don't share any more examples. You did this a bunch in the teaching. Let's cut the example of.
I did. Sorry. That's why it was an hour and a half.
But I think, yeah. So, and I think the no touching one, like most people know how to kind of play that safe, unless they're clearly like, no, it's perfectly, like what you said, like, yeah, no, check your heart. It's kind of gross. So, but I think there's another side where touch could probably be, it's something where you probably need to get over it, and you need to use touch to actually minister to people. And there's a very like clear line of like, do not cross this, and for, people of the opposite sex, like the reality is usually you do not need to be the person, like men, as good as it might feel, you do not need to be the person to have like the woman crying on your shoulder and stuff.
Right.
But like around, like just, when men don't have the physical affection from their own family, and have never seen that demonstrated, it seems like trying to give that back in any type of setting where it could be useful, they really, really shy away from and really struggle with. Like, I mean, am I off on this? Is there something that you're kind of thinking like specifically around of like, no, this would be a, like, hey, you should probably actually put your hand on them. You should probably lay hands and pray for them, whatever it might be.
Yeah, there's actually there's a guy that I know, Jerry, who used to lead a Monday night Bible study, and he would do this a lot. He would, pray in a very classic Christian way of, hands on the shoulder, very intimate level of prayer. But the context was appropriate, where he would first, I got invited by a friend to this Bible study. Hey, man, we're having a home Bible study. Jerry's running it. He's a pastor. Really cool dude. You should check it out. And then Jerry started texting me, and he would start texting me, introduce himself, let me know that he wants to invite me, ask me what my favorite food is. And then we have it that Monday night, because he would always cook for everybody there. And it was only like 5 or 6 of us that would show up, just a couple of young guys. And as we continued meeting, the conversations, of course, like any group of 5 to 6 people, become personal and intimate levels of conversation. And eventually it would get to the point where we do prayer nights, and Jerry would ask, can I lay hands on you and pray for you? It sounds like you're going through a lot. And he would do this all the time. And you would just see like grown men burst into tears, because it was the first time they had physical touch in such a long time, that just the simple gesture of someone in a brotherly way laying hands on them and praying for them as a mentor figure, like a father figure they didn't have for some of these guys, would just kind of break them as soon as it happened. And just the simple act of laying hands on somebody in an appropriate way during prayer would change men, even more than the prayer actually being said or the conversations we had. So I think that's just one example of where touch is used in a way that glorifies God, and all that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right on. And I think that's something that, like, you have to be able to really lay these things before Jesus and kind of sense behind that of like what is appropriate, what isn't, and ask for some clear wisdom and guidance. Like, and I think what you've kind of talked through and what you talked through last night was right on of like, yeah, this is really kind of the boundaries of where you really need to stick it out. And, don't cross this, don't be weird, but also be open, to where it
Yeah.
can be useful. One of the most awkward times I have of like using physical touch is usually with someone on their deathbed or in the hospital, where they can genuinely really use that touch to know like, hey, it's going to be okay. Those are really, really tough times. And you don't necessarily you don't want to, because it feels very uncomfortable, but it's the best thing that can help out for them, So I think there's a lot of different things that can go around this, but you spend a lot of time talking also around the physicality of things, and like a physical location or the physical place itself. So you have your senses and how those kind of engage, but there's something about a place and the way the place kind of looks or feels or something like that God can kind of use, and that we should be in tune with as well. Tell us a little more about what that physical place actually means, like an actual physical place for someone can actually mean, and how that can be, a gift from God, or honestly even a curse from God, or whatever it might be.
Yeah. Well, I think, what kind of started that part of the discussion too was a quote from Zach in his book, where he says, quote, "We sensibly minister the gospel of Jesus to ordinary people in their particular places." And from that quote and from the scripture in 1 John that we read, we really went into this whole conversation of how, depending on your experience in life, there's just certain places and certain areas that you go that have such a strong connection to who you are. For instance, I have certain places here in Aurora and Denver that when I go to them, memories are brought up, emotions that I haven't experienced in a long time. And it's amazing how just being there, just going to that place. So for instance, one example is one of the old churches that I used to go to. As soon as I walk in and I see the building, I'm flooded with emotions, good emotions, bad emotions, mixed emotions, all at once. And there's no controlling it. Places just have that effect on people, because we're we're physical people in a physical place, and there's a connection. And actually, N.T. Wright writes about this in really good detail in Simply Jesus, his book, where Jesus understood this, and that by referring to himself as the temple, and that he was going to restore things in that way, he was referring to an idea in Judaism where the temple was kind of considered a touchstone point between heaven and earth, and that the kingdom of God was here. And that when Jesus was saying the kingdom of God is here, he would always refer beyond just the physical place. It's not just the temple anymore, it's everywhere. So places can have spiritual significance as well, like a temple, but Jesus kind of broke ground in saying that any place can have spiritual significance now that he's here, now that he started things with his ministry. And ever since then, people can have spiritual moments at any place. There could be, like Andrew, you probably remember, the venue where you got married. There's probably certain emotions and feelings that you had, memories that you had at that physical place. There's when we go to astronomy contest.
Old people, because it was in an old people church. So there's just a sense of like, yes, sweet aroma of marriage. Old.
And those who have laid the path before me.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like every place has some sort of mind to body connection where we just need to be there, and there's negative examples, of course. Like you have those hometown heroes where it's like they peaked in 10th grade and they can't get over the fact that their whole identity is wrapped up in 4 blocks of their life that they've lived in their entire life, and they've never moved beyond that place, and they're afraid to change. And we see that in scripture too, where the sister-in-law to Ruth that didn't go to the new land with Orpah and Ruth couldn't leave. She couldn't leave the land that she was from in spite of all the changes that were happening, that were negative, this pandemic, this famine that was going on. And we kind of see that too with people who are moving to Texas, Idaho, Florida, where the opposite's happening as well, where people are very stubborn of like, I just can't leave here. Everything's here. This is my home, and because there's that emotional attachment of like, we're made for a physical place, and it's hard to leave physical places because of all the memories that we've built up in that.
But what do we as Christians kind of need to be, or as ministers or leaders or just in the faith need to be aware of because of that? Like 100%, like I think it makes sense of what you're saying of like, yeah, this is a physical place, like it triggers certain things, it can trigger positive or negative emotions, and you can have attachments to places and stuff. What are we supposed to do with that as Christians then? Like,
yeah. Well, I think the first thing is that when you're talking to anybody as a Christian, acknowledging the identity that's associated with the place that they're from. And this takes a while of just kind of understanding a person, really being open-minded and having those conversations with people, because, the more you assume about somebody, the less you know about them until you know them, and you can't assume it. And place is one of those things where, if I assume that you're from Alabama versus New York, I'm going to assume certain things about people from Alabama versus people in New York. But if I actually talk to somebody from Alabama, I'm going to learn a lot more about them. I'm going to learn about why the city that they're from matters so much, why they get so much joy in the morning, waking up and realizing they're in the city that they love, why people move to a new city and they love it. There's a just such a strong connection to identity and where you reside that we need to be aware of as Christians and how we minister to people, because, sometimes in very negative cases, like when people get evicted, for instance, my brother used to run an eviction job. He would say the negative aspects of people just can't leave. People are supposed to move, but they can't leave, and what that does to somebody. And then the positive of when you do get to leave, and you find a new home and you stay there, like what you kind of do with Hannah and your family when you guys moved. There's a stability that comes with it too. So just understanding that, a strong pull on our identity is the place that we find ourselves in, and being aware of that so that we can minister to people where they're at, not where we want them to be.
Yeah. And I think that's the biggest thing is like, you may not feel an attachment to a certain place, but someone else might,
Yeah.
when you want to make a change on a church building, the older lady who started it up and like they remember their first sweetheart kiss under that church building, like
Yeah.
that's their thing. They remember that place,
Can't change the chairs, can't change the carpet.
right? Because like there's certain things that are triggered around it, and you as well, you might be very, very much attached to some of those things, like what you were talking about. Like you could be very much attached to it, but it's like, okay, do I have to be though? Like, what am I afraid about losing with this thing?
Mhm.
And I think there's some things that you need to have is like actual, like, Ebenezer's or whatever, of like good reminders. But I think sometimes there's a deeper thing that we have to try to address with ourselves, in our identity with God around it, like what you're saying. So I like that. So we're talking about this physicality, we're talking about place, we talked about, touch itself. What do we need to do then next as Christians? Like, what do we need to take for ourselves, as how Jesus wants to minister to us and work in us? And what do we need to do outwardly as well when we're trying to be there for someone else, when we're trying to have community or to build relationships or make disciples with someone else? Like, what do we need to be doing?
Yeah. And that kind of ties into the last thing that we kind of discussed as a team and during our service, was that all physical things, places, people, objects, they affect the mind, they affect who we are. And really the takeaway was in 2 Timothy 1:3-5, where Paul is encouraging Timothy to be present in the moment, physically present in the moment. When you're ministering to somebody on their deathbed, like you brought up, Andrew, listening to them, listening to the tone of their voice, listening to the sounds in the room, being physically present and listening and hearing, using that sense, seeing where they're at life, seeing the condition that they're in, um, touch, holding their hand. Maybe they need that physical touch and being aware of it, and um, asking if you can hold their hand and then doing that or whatever that might be. Um, and you can go through all of the senses and kind of do that, but there's actually in the book, Zach beautifully, in a way that I can't, and I wish I had the quote, lists out ways that you can be physically present with all of your senses. And he kind of gives a method of like, just go through each one. Are you physically listening? Are you physically seeing? Are you physically touching the ground that you're on? Walking in somebody else's shoes, understanding where they're coming from? Are you, um, you know, aware of all the senses in this moment? Because that's how you can be in the moment. And Jesus did this beautifully all the time. And we need to emulate his way of doing things by engaging all the senses. And in that way, loving our neighbor by being 100% there. Because there's other moments where we're not 100% there and people notice, people notice when you're not listening. People notice when you're not paying attention. So if anything, just be intentional with where you're at when you're meeting with somebody.
Awesome. What about internally? Like, what would Jesus want to do with us personally in that then? Like, if we're not ministering, but like, what do we need to be aware of for Jesus to minister to us in this physical moment?
Yeah. Well, like you kind of said, the Ebenezer stones or these relics that we have, sometimes it's always worth revisiting some of these, like Zach has this great quote where he says, bodily senses accompany our interior lives. At times they can adorn our souls with treasures, and at times litter them with trash. And a part of positive self-talk, as psychologists would say, a part of improving ourselves is taking hold of the treasures that we hold tight to. Maybe it's a certain memento that we've accumulated over time. Maybe it's enjoying physically being in your home with your kids and really engaging all five senses to be in the moment with your family. Maybe it's engaging all five senses to be the best coworker you can be. But internally too, by understanding who we are physically, we can understand who God is spiritually, and that we understand how limited we are, and we understand how man, I really need God. Like, now that I'm paying attention to what's going on in this moment, life's kind of amazing. Like, it's amazing how there's so much going on in the world, and yet God knows who I am. I'm completely engaged in the moment. Whether it's in those quiet moments of prayer or whether it's in the busyness of the workday, internally we can rest in the fact that when we engage in all five of the senses, we can connect to Jesus in the sense that he did too. And there's kind of a beauty in that, in understanding that no matter where I go, where what I've done or do, Jesus has been there and can relate to us, and we can always go to him and find comfort in that. So,
yeah, awesome, great, man. I think those are great points. From what you kind of talked about last night. I know I gave you a hard time for how many examples and how far over you went over, but I think it was all really good stuff, Chris, from what you'd covered, and it was a lot to cover, and I think you communicated it really well on what we needed to be able to go through, and it's something we need to be able to take time, and it's probably not we'll probably not get the most just from listening to this, but then going out and just testing it, like what you were saying, of going out and go in silence, see what that's like, see what God is wanting to teach you away from the noise. When you're talking to someone, try to really listen to everything that's going on, and how flustered they could be because of how much other noise is going on. When you are eating something, just really take that moment and see what does this trigger back for you and stuff. Mm-hmm. So I think that's something that we can all just take a moment and just try to do that and reflect what it means to be in that physical realm itself. So
yeah, absolutely. And I would highly encourage people just to test it out. Again, like Zach pointed out, go through those 5 categories and really see how much more you can enjoy the moment by slowing down and taking the time to live that ordinary life. So with that said, we do have just some quick updates as far as the church goes. We have our back to school event coming up at the end of August. So we want you guys to be there. DM us for details. We're going to have details in our socials, so we can pass those off to you. And then we're continuing our series on an ordinary life. We're going to go into more of the senses, understanding more of what it means to live an ordinary life. So this Sunday, 5:30 to 7, we hope you are there at the Reunion Coffee House. And outside of that, any other updates that you can think of, Andrew, as far as the church and what we're doing?
September freaking 19th, Chris.
Oh, shoot.
September freaking 19th.
Also, September freaking 19th, we have a new series called Grace Talk, where essentially we're going to first go over what grace is not in the weeks leading up to it on our socials. So stay tuned for that. And then we're going to spend about 10 weeks going into what grace is. What does it mean to live a grace-filled life? What does grace mean versus mercy? What is grace in the new covenant versus the old covenant? Am I even worthy of grace? Conversations around that. And it's going to be a really good conversation about just grace in general. We hope to see you there starting September 19th, or as Andrew put it, September freaking 19th.
And if you're upset at me for saying freaking, listen to our next podcast.
Yes.
So
yeah, this will be the prequel to that one. But yeah, it's going to be, and we have our own books too. So this is going to be something that we've invested a lot of time into. We want you to show up. And if you bring somebody, we'll pay you if they stick around for 3 or more sessions, so we really want people to show up. We really want to get a good group going, and can't wait to see you there. But with that said, we're going to let you guys get back to it, and we'll talk to you later.